Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the second Sunday after Pentecost for the week of June 2nd, 2024. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I'm excited that now we are in what I think of as the growing season within the church. The season after Pentecost, where a lot of churches that follow a lectionary calendar, you go to green for now half the year, basically. This is our growing time. This is our time where we dig back into some things, and we'll even see it with where we're going to be going this week. It's time where we have to sit and reflect, but also then how we're going to build upon what we have gone through and accomplished over the last 6 months or so, from Jesus' birth to the Easter resurrection and Lent thrown in there in between. This is the season now where we start really building upon those ideas, and I really do enjoy this season after Pentecost, because this is where really the rubber starts meeting the road. But before we jump into where we're going to go this week, we have to look back to last week's question, which was, where do you allow yourself to be creative and serious and allow the artist and scientist to coexist? And we had a really good example from a loyal listener talking about in their life how they had a teaching job, but things kind of fell through, and then they got to a point where they were owning an engine shop, and then things got slim pickings with that before snowblowers had really taken on. So then they went back for more education and ended up being in the church and talking about how they had both a profession but also a skilled craft and how those benefited each other to be able to have both. And I think that's part of what we were kind of getting at a little bit last week was when we are looking at a triune God, it's recognizing and understanding the aspect that we have a God that has multiple different sides, and we're trying to understand all of those. They all coexist. They all work together. They all are still the same person, but it's also the aspect that each of those bring different gifts and abilities. And just as we are very complex with different gifts and abilities, we need to be able to allow ourselves the opportunity to be able to see that within God ourselves. And that in and of itself, I think, is so important. And especially as we are approaching now this growing season, as I'm saying, I think it's important for us to acknowledge and recognize all those different parts of ourselves to be able to grow in the best possible way moving forward. So let's just jump into it. We now are into the season where we have alternative first readings, which is a fun season of the church year. So one of the Old Testament readings you'll potentially hear is from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 10 and optionally 11 through 20. This is a very familiar text. This is where you have Samuel and Eli, and this is where God is calling Samuel. And at first, Samuel doesn't recognize. He keeps going to Eli. And we have to remember that this is a period of time where the word of the Lord was rare in those days, coming from verse 1. And Eli is getting kind of confused of why does Samuel keep coming. But after 2 times, Eli then recognizes what is going on. For when the Lord calls, Samuel then says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that's what we then get in verse 10, where Samuel says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." We then get in the alternative verses with that is that the tribe of Israel, and specifically of Eli's descendants, have really let God down, and God's going to be going in a different direction. This is the prophet Samuel that we are getting here. And that the house of the Lord, the priest of Eli, will no longer be carrying that mantle, and it'll be this transfer. And it's this difficult news that Samuel wants to hide from Eli, but Eli insists, "Tell me what it is." And so that's what happens. And we get that Samuel grew up in the Lord and continues then to be this trustworthy prophet for the people of Israel. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 139, verses 1 to 6 and 13 through 18. This is a psalm then recognizing and kind of playing off of that theme a little bit more, where we have a God who understands us completely and knows our movements, knows what we are doing, knows us inside and out. And we even get that where we have a mothering aspect of God, which I always think is important to point out in verse 13. For you have formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. And recognizing how God has been part of us from the very beginning and is coexisting and working with us, and that this is something that we should be giving honor and praise to in that. The alternative first reading is from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. This is definitely a text that plays into the gospel this week, but it's talking about observing the Sabbath and how we have to remember part of the reason of the Sabbath is recognizing when we were slaves in Egypt, that God delivered us out of that so that we can rest, that we were not designed to go every single day, that there is times where we are meant to rest and we are meant to take a time for our bodies to be renewed. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 81, the first 10 verses of it. And this is recognizing, one, that God is the strength in allowing us to do all this. So then two, coming even from verse 2, that we should be raising a song and giving praise to God, recognizing what God has done for us and continues to be with us, the tribe of Israel, even as we continue to struggle and at times struggle to listen to God, that God continues to be with us and continues to provide for his people. The New Testament text then, the second reading, is from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 5 to 12. This then is, if we are proclaiming to be people of Jesus Christ, we need to let our light shine. We need to be able to not be destroyed or persecuted or fully dismayed by things that are going on, recognizing that what Christ has done for our sake has made us bring forth life, and it's allowing us to shine this light so that we then recognize that we have been here and placed here for something greater. And it also gives us the ability to look beyond the situation which we're in and recognizing that God is with us and carrying us through some of those difficult situations so that we don't get necessarily caught up in just what is going on that is going to distract us from where God is trying to bring us or where God is wanting our light to shine by us saying that this is impossible or too difficult, that God has already been there and in that midst and is willing to be there for us. The gospel text this week is out of Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. This is the Pharisees trying to catch Jesus, really is what it is. And remember, the Pharisees are the leaders of the temple. They're the leaders of the law. They are trying to do things to the T. And so they find Jesus with his disciples plucking grain heads out in the fields. And the Pharisees are kind of accusing Jesus of, are you not supposed to be doing any work on the Sabbath? That is not what we're designed to be doing, essentially. And Jesus responds with, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So this recognition of we're the ones needing the Sabbath, not that the Sabbath needs us. And thus, Jesus then enters a synagogue and sees a man with a withered hand. Knowing what's going to probably happen, he asks the man to come forward and heals the man's hand, and this gives the Pharisees some things to go and talk to the Herodians about on how they are dismayed with Jesus and how, yet again, Jesus is going against what they feel is right. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcast, their commentaries, their discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give you some ideas and direction and ways to think about and contemplate these texts. So, if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, going through the Revised Common Lectionary. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but there's also art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, even a daily devotion. It's an amazing resource and yet again helps you prepare for the upcoming week. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. These resources offer you a wide variety of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, along with weekly reflection looking at what the lectionary texts are. If you enjoy listening to me talk about these texts for a half an hour, thinking about it from a science perspective, you will enjoy checking out these reflections, looking at these texts, and hearing about some different ways to be thinking about God within the environment. So if you haven't checked out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications, that'll be the first link down in the show notes. What jumped out to me this week, specifically from the Mark text and the alternative text from 1 Samuel, is there are times in life that we get messages that we don't want to hear. And how willing and able are we to hear those messages and adjust? Because that's part of what we even have in the 2 Corinthians text, is this recognition of we have to be able to adapt. We have to be able to recognize that what we are being called into is something that continues to evolve and change. And that means as we continue to learn and grow, we need to be able to adjust our expectations. Folks, we have a worldwide epidemic, one of many, that we've briefly talked about before, but I think it's worth talking about more because I think it's something that we as a society need to think about and contemplate. How are we going to evolve and change? And it's going to make our lives look different. It's going to be difficult, but necessary. And that is, we have a problem with microplastics. So what are microplastics? Microplastics are plastics that have gotten into our water system in particular, but just into our ecosystem as a whole. A lot of times it's from plastics breaking down over time, especially exposure to sunlight or repeating of the water washing over them, something where that's allowing them to decay. Most plastics are some type of crude oil being able to be made into the structure that they are, and thus, with it being that, it takes hundreds, if not thousands of years for many of these plastics to break down completely back into organic matter. The issue that we are finding with this is they are getting all over the place. I'll attach a link down to a story from SciShow from a couple months ago talking about how the Arctic is drowning in plastic. And it's not necessarily due to the aspect of tons of people being up in the Arctic. A lot of it is, yes, there are some remote villages and trying to figure out waste disposal is very difficult. But additionally, you have a lot of currents bringing a lot of different plastics that are already in the ocean from both Europe and North America and Asia, Russia, bringing those up in there. And again, as the water washes over them, they start to break down into smaller pieces. Doesn't mean they're going to fully dissolve. And so thus they start getting into things, and we're noticing it even into ice cores, and we're noticing it in the ocean bed. And since we can only really track where 1% of our plastics end up, it's one of the things that has been a continued problem is, yes, we have these big garbage floating islands out in the Pacific and different regions of the oceans, but also that they're potentially getting into the seafloor and going deeper. There also is the problem that, especially in the Arctic, there is a lot of rivers that dump into the Arctic Ocean as well, from northern parts of North America and Asia and Europe coming into that area as well, and it's bringing all that different trash and things of that nature along with it that goes into the column of water that goes into the Arctic. All of these kind of culminate where now you have where things that we associate within our ecosystems are also having issues with this. I'll attach a video down below that comes from 60 Minutes from the end of 2018, talking about how albatrosses have been shown that the Pacific garbage patch in particular for them is causing for these albatrosses to be eating more and more plastics. And because the plastics don't break down, it fills up their stomach and makes them feel full, even though they're not full, which then leads to death. And there has even been now some studies starting to show that certain forms of seabirds have ingested more and more microplastics, had more disease-causing and antibiotic-resistant microorganisms in their gut due to the amount of microplastics that are in their gut. And microplastics are defined as any plastic that is less than 5 millimeters across. What are we going to do about all of this? And I think it's a question that is hard for us to answer. I think it's one of those moments where Jesus is like responding to the Pharisees of the Sabbath is for you to be able to recharge and glorify God. Not that the Sabbath is there and that you need to be honoring it. And I think right now when we look at many of the plastics within our lives, a lot of them are out of convenience. Yes, there is things like even right now as I'm recording this, there is plastics all around me. From the mouse that I use to the pop filter over the microphone to the monitors that I'm looking at, there's plastics all over. But also think about like in your refrigerator and how many single-use plastics are in your fridge or even in your day-to-day life. How many different things that we're using as single-use plastics are, again, we have to remember these are fossil fuels, a non-renewable resource that we are using and that we're finding then take a tremendous amount of time to break down in the environment. We have to remember that plastics themselves are not 100 years old. This is something that is more of a recent discovery in this timeline of humanity. So there's a lot of things that we use now just out of habit that we think, oh yeah, this is not a big deal, that traditionally it wouldn't have been done that way. And I think this is where it kind of allows us to be thinking about getting back to what we hear in Mark and what we hear in the 1 Samuel story. Samuel, when he hears the message from God and that the house of the Lord is no longer going to be with Eli's house because they've let him down. Samuel doesn't want to tell Eli this. Eli insists to hear the difficult news and does not want to have it hid from him. Folks, I think we are seeing more and more that these plastics, yes, there is a time and a place for them, but I think we also need to be more conscientious on how we're doing this. We are seeing that there is damaging effects within our ecosystems and that they are long lasting and take a tremendous amount of time for them to break down. This is stuff that takes a tremendous amount of time for us to be able to recognize the long-term implications of what we are doing. Are we willing and able to adapt and change? Are we willing and able to give up some of the perceived convenience of plastics to go into something that is more renewable, that's going to be easier on the environment and the ecosystem as a whole? Recognizing that, yet again, that we are part of that ecosystem. Recognizing that if the ecosystem is doing well, it allows us a greater possibility of also doing well. That's where I think like Psalm 139 really plays in. That God knows our innermost thoughts and is with us and through us and gives us the ability to give praise, but it's also us being able to acknowledge it, then it's the wisdom comes also from God. And I think in a lot of ways we recognize with a lot of these different problems that we are having with plastics that we do need to reduce our dependence on them. But how? I think there is an aspect of figuring that out, and that's a question that is a little bit beyond my scope purely here, outside of me saying reduce our use of them, which is difficult, don't get me wrong. But I think it's also recognizing that in doing that, it also gives us a freedom as well. One example that I think of is the property that my wife and I purchased. One of the things that we have talked about and know that we need to do at some point is there is a couple spots on the land where there was different trash and stuff just buried. And nature does as nature does and tries to overcome and does its best to its ability. But I also know at some point, for my own mental sake, that I am going to have to uncover and go through and try to remove that stuff. Because I know it's not going to break down on its own. And for me, that at least allows me the possibility of bringing that to some place that potentially can do some better way of breaking that down than just randomly in the middle of the woods or in the middle of where I'm at. It means me trying to be more responsible, even though it wasn't necessarily me who put it there. It's me recognizing that if I'm able to get that to another place that potentially can break that down, it gets it out of the ecosystem of other creation that where it could be damaging. One of the things that I know is like the microfungi that is the connecting network for a lot of the different trees and things, as we've talked about before. Plastics kill that stuff so much. It doesn't allow for the connections that fungi make as easily. It's not organic. It doesn't conduct the same way. Thus, me trying to remove that from the ecosystem allows for that ecosystem to get to a healthier state in the long run. In the short term, yes, when I'm turning up the soil and looking through and getting that stuff out, it's not necessarily going to look pretty. But in the long run, it's going to help for the long-term sustainability of that land. I think sometimes we need to be able to think about things in a longer scope, in a longer term situation. Jesus is calling out, and even in the 2 Corinthians, when we're tasked with something like this, when we're tasked with the idea of getting rid of or reducing dramatically our consumption as a world of plastics, it seems crazy. It seems hard to get our head around, to be blunt. But we also then have to recognize and acknowledge that here we have text saying that, yes, Christ has been there and has gone through that and has given us the ability to be able to take on difficult tasks like this, to work on something that's going to benefit the whole body of Christ for the betterment of the world, than us just giving up because it's hard. It's allowing us the ability to shine a light into a dark spot. I think when we think about microplastics, when we think about how they've had lasting effects on places that we care about and love, it's sad. And I think it's one of those times, especially as we are in a season of growing, it's for us to acknowledge places where we have room to grow. It's acknowledging and thinking about, how do I become a better steward of the environment? If I'm going to have something of plastic, how am I going to make sure that that gets to a place where it can get recycled, that it doesn't get out into the other ecosystem, and trust that they're going to do the right decisions with that? How do I reduce my plastic consumption in general to make sure that it doesn't continue to get into the ice cores as it's freezing up in the Arctic? To reduce my amount that is getting out into places that we don't expect plastics to be? How do I look at things beyond the human and start acknowledging the globe around me? I think these are important questions and important things for us to be thinking about. So the question I have for you this week is, how can we be better stewards of the environment even when it's difficult? How can we be better stewards of the environment even when it's difficult? Because I can acknowledge, I think it's going to be very difficult to reduce our plastic consumption, but I also know that it is possible. And just having that old adage that comes from Dumb and Dumber, so you're telling me there's a chance, it has to be an aspect of us within our faith in general, because that's partially what we cling on to. We watch the impossible become possible. From Jesus coming and being with us, from Jesus not dying initially, to Jesus' resurrection and promise that Jesus is coming again. to the Holy Spirit coming and being with us, to having a God create and want to have relationship with us. We are in a faith that deals with things that don't seem probable, but yet they are possible. And sometimes I think we get caught up where, yes, sometimes it's that we need to be making sure that we're taking Sabbath. Sometimes it's us feeling like the letter of the law, the hill is too big to climb. It's just easier to just follow it purely by how we have always interpreted it, instead of somebody coming in and questioning how we think about it. Sometimes not acknowledging the history of we had a world that functioned for a long period of time without plastic. And they were able to do it quite well. But it means that we then have to adjust, adapt. And sometimes that's hard. But yet, I believe that is where God meets us at our core. Can we figure out a way to reduce plastics? Yes. Is it going to take a lot of work? Yes. Is it going to be fixed overnight? No. But we also know some of the most rewarding things within life, within faith, don't happen overnight. Stuff that takes long time, stuff that takes a lot of preparation. It's stuff that we have worked on for an extended period of time that eventually we can see our progress. And that is where we're at. And so I think as we are in this growing season, I think this is a good challenge for us to be thinking about, is how do we make a lasting impact beyond and letting our light shine forth into dark places, like we hear about in the 2 Corinthians text. Recognizing we need this ability for Sabbath for us to rest. It might mean for us to be able to rest, to acknowledge, heck, we're doing some damage here. We might need to adjust some things. It's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, but it's possible. And that's what we need to be able to believe. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.